The courthouse clock had not yet struck 9 when Clara Voss walked through the door of the Harlan County Municipal Hall carrying a cardboard box sealed with packing tape and 2 rubber bands. And the room went so quiet you could hear the tape on the walls where the estate notices had been pinned. There were perhaps 40 people gathered there that Tuesday, in the first week of October. Farmers mostly, a few small business owners, the kind of people who had been sleeping poorly for 6 weeks because a man named Gerald Pratt, regional director of a land management consortium called Meridian Land Holdings, had been making the rounds of their failing operations with a clipboard and a very reasonable smile. They had come expecting to watch the morning's scheduled disposition hearing become a formality. They had come expecting to watch Clara Voss, as they said in the hall before she arrived, finally face the arithmetic. What they had not expected was the box. What they had not expected was the expression on her face, which was not triumphant, and was not vengeful, and was not afraid. It was the face of a woman who had read every page of something and understood every line and had simply come to share what she had found. Gerald Pratt was already seated at the long table to the left of the county mediator's desk, flanked by 2 men from his consortium's legal team, their folders arranged in 3 precise stacks. He saw Clara come in. He glanced at the box. He looked away. Later, people said that was the moment they should have known. The land remembers what the ledger reveals, and the ledger does not forget a single entry. Clara set the box on the table directly across from him, placed her hands flat on either side of it, and looked out at the room full of people who had spent the better part of 2 years either pitying her or dismissing her. She did not speak yet. She was waiting for the mediator. But the room was already listening in a way it had never listened to her before, and perhaps that is where the story should properly begin, which is to say, not here, not in the endgame, but on the morning 18 months earlier, when she drove a borrowed pickup down a gravel road toward a property the entire county had quietly agreed was a lost cause, and her whole inheritance was folded in an envelope on the passenger seat, and she was the only one alive who believed it was enough. She had come to Harlan County because her father had died there, or rather, she had come because her father had lived there for 11 years without telling her, and when he died, he had left a name in a will that nobody else knew to look for. His name had been Raymond Voss. He had been a surveyor's assistant, then a surveyor, then for the last 6 years of his life, something the probate attorney described to Clara as a records custodian for a small agricultural consulting firm that had since dissolved. The attorney's name was Stafford, a courteous, dry-mannered man who had called Clara in Cincinnati on a Wednesday afternoon to tell her that her father had passed of a cardiac event 3 weeks prior, that she was the sole named heir in a valid notarized will, and that the estate, after legal fees and a small outstanding property tax arrears of $1,100 he had helpfully already deducted, amounted to a parcel of land measuring 17 acres on the eastern slope of the county's ridge line, together with the buildings thereon, together with all contents, together with whatever was described on a single, handwritten addendum attached to the will that Stafford frankly admitted he had not been able to fully parse because the handwriting was cramped and the paper was water-spotted, and it appeared to reference documents stored on the property itself. Clara had not spoken to her father in 4 years. She had not seen him in 9. She sat at her kitchen table after the call and looked at the wall for a long time before she did anything at all. Then she gave 30 days' notice at her apartment, put her furniture in a storage unit, and drove to Harlan County with everything she owned and $4,200 in a checking account, which was all that remained after the storage deposit and the first tank of gas. The property was not, by any gentle definition, promising. The farmhouse had been built in the 1940s, modified badly twice, and sat at the end of a lane so overgrown with sumac and volunteer mulberry that she had to get out of the truck 3 times to move branches. The barn was structurally sound but dark, the kind of darkness that smells like old iron and something organic and decades deep. The outbuildings included a collapsed equipment shed, a functioning but elderly well house with an electric pump, and a low-roofed structure behind the barn that Clara initially took for a second storage shed until she looked inside and found it was not a storage shed at all, but a climate-controlled room with walls of fitted shelving, a battery-backed ventilation unit, and 3 dozen wooden archive crates stacked in rows, each one numbered in her father's hand. She stood in the door of that room for a long time. The room was dry, the room was cool, the room had been maintained. She did not touch the crates that day. She went back to the farmhouse, which at least had running water and a functional furnace. And she sat at the kitchen table that her father had evidently used as a workspace, given the stacks of manila folders and the 2 mechanical pencils worn down to their last inch. And she tried to work out her arithmetic. $4,200 minus the $1,100 already paid in back taxes left $3,100. She had no income. She had no job lined up. She had 17 acres of scrubby slopeland, a barn she did not yet understand, and 37 archive crates left to her by a man she had barely known in his later years. That was the sum. She wrote it on a piece of paper and looked at it until it stopped being frightening and became simply the ledger she was working from. She met Gerald Pratt for the first time 5 days after her arrival, when she drove into town to register the property transfer and pay the remaining transfer fees. He found her outside the county recorder's office, which suggested he had been watching the filings, and he introduced himself with a handshake warm enough to run a household on. He was 53, well-dressed for the county, and he had the particular manner of a man who has spent a career gently explaining to people that their situation is worse than they think, but that he, fortunately, is in a position to help. He told her he had heard about the Voss parcel. He told her he was sorry for her loss. He told her that Meridian Land Holdings had a strong interest in ridgeline parcels for a watershed management project they were developing, and that if she was interested in a quick and clean resolution, he was empowered to offer her $12,000 for the land and buildings as is, no inspection required. He said this with the tone of a man being generous. Clara told him she would think about it, which was a thing she said not because she was considering it, but because she had learned long ago that it was the quietest way to end a conversation. She drove back to the property and wrote $12,000 in her notebook and circled it because it told her something. A man does not offer $12,000 for something worth $12,000. He offers $12,000 for something worth considerably more because the $12,000 is the price he has calculated you can be panicked into accepting before you have had time to learn otherwise. The archive room was where her education began. She opened the first crate on a Saturday morning with a cup of coffee and no particular expectation, and what she found was not what she had imagined, which was perhaps old survey maps or decommissioned professional records. What she found was a system. Her father had spent 11 years building a system. Raymond Voss had been, in his surveying work, a meticulous man, and in retirement he had turned that meticulousness toward the county's land transaction history. Every crate was organized by year. Every year contained copies of deed transfers, tax assessments, mineral rights filings, conservation easement registrations, water table surveys, and in some years, dense handwritten ledgers in which Raymond Voss had cross-referenced discrepancies between the official county records and the originating documents from which those records had supposedly been drawn. Clara was not a lawyer. She had been, before coming to Harlan County, a billing specialist for a medical group, which meant she understood how numbers in a system were supposed to agree with one another and what it looked like when they did not. She began reading on that Saturday, and she did not stop in any meaningful sense for 11 weeks. She went to town when she needed food. She answered her phone when she had to. She let the sumac continue to grow on the lane. But every morning she was in the archive room with her coffee and her own ledger notebook, and every evening she was there still, cross-checking, following the threads her father had laid out with the patience of someone who had expected that one day someone else would need to follow them. She told no one what she was finding. This was partly caution and partly instinct, and partly because she had not yet found enough to be certain, and a thing half known is a liability. She described it to herself in the ledger notebook as banking heat, not lighting a fire, not announcing smoke. Banking heat, the way the old cast-iron furnace in the farmhouse banked a low charge of coal through the night, so that in the morning there was still a living ember under the ash, and you could rebuild from it without starting cold. She was banking heat. She was not yet ready to open the door and let the air in. She was in the archive room on a Tuesday afternoon in early December when she heard tires on the gravel, and went out to find an old green pickup she did not recognize, and a woman standing beside it whom she also did not recognize, though she would have if she had been in the county longer. The woman was Marta Solis, 71 years old, who had farmed the adjacent parcel to the north for 30 years after immigrating from Oaxaca with her late husband and 2 sons. She had deep-set dark eyes and the hands of someone who had spent decades in soil, and she looked at Clara with an expression that was neither pitying nor impressed, but simply attentive, the way a person looks at a new plant to determine whether it is going to take. She had brought a jar of something preserved, and she handed it over without ceremony. She said she had heard a woman was living in the Voss place alone. She said she had respected Raymond enough to come and see whether his daughter was all right. Clara said she was all right. Marta looked at the archive room door, which was open, and at the notebook under Clara's arm. And she said something then that Clara wrote down that same evening and did not fully understand until much later. She said, in her accented and carefully chosen English, "The land does not hide, it holds. There is a difference. What is hidden in the land you can dig up. What the land holds, it gives back when it is ready, not when you demand. You must know which kind of thing you're looking for." Then she nodded, said she would come again Thursday with something better for the cold, and got back in her truck and drove away. Clara stood in the yard with a jar of preserved chilies and thought about the difference between hidden and held, and thought about her father's archive room, and thought that perhaps she was beginning to understand. The child appeared in February, without explanation. He was 10 years old, small-boned and watchful, named Eli, the youngest of 4 children belonging to the Dreher family, who rented a house a mile and a half down the road from Clara's lane. He arrived one Saturday morning while Clara was clearing ice from the well-house drain, and stood at a distance of about 12 feet without saying anything. Clara asked if he wanted something. He said he had seen the lights on late and wondered if she needed help. She said she could probably use help. He asked what kind. She said she was mostly working inside right now. He said he was good at quiet work. She said that was exactly the kind she had. He came every Saturday after that, and occasionally on school days when something was clearly troubling him enough to give him permission to skip. He never asked what was in the crates. He organized, he filed, he ran errands in the order she gave them. When Clara's eyes were tired from reading, she sometimes read sections aloud to him, not the significant sections, but the drier passages, and he listened in a way that told her he was absorbing more than he let on. He never mocked the archive. He never asked why it mattered. He said once, looking up from a stack of folders he was alphabetizing, that the numbers in these old papers are different from the numbers in the county's new computer database he had seen at school during a civics assignment. Clara said yes, she had noticed that. He went back to his alphabetizing and did not say anything more. It was enough. It was more than enough. By March, she had mapped the core of it. What her father had spent 11 years documenting was not a single fraud, but a pattern, slow and patient and structural, the kind of thing that only becomes visible when you align enough years of records side by side. Meridian Land Holdings and its predecessor entities had, over a period of nearly 22 years, systematically acquired mineral rights and water access easements on ridgeline parcels throughout the eastern county through a process that her father's ledgers described with the word substitution. The originating deeds contained easement language that reserved water access rights to the original landowners. The recorded copies in the county system did not contain this language. The language had been removed or altered at some point between origination and recording. Raymond Voss had spent 11 years obtaining certified copies of originating deeds from state archives, county archives, and in several cases from the landowners themselves, and comparing them line by line with the recorded versions. His ledgers listed 27 parcels. 17 of them were now either owned by Meridian or subject to Meridian's water access claims. 6 of the original landowners were still in the county, still farming, and still unaware that the deeds they had signed 20 years ago had said something different from the deeds now on file at the county recorder's office. The other 11 parcels had changed hands multiple times, in most cases to buyers who had no idea what the underlying deed discrepancies meant for their water rights. Clara's 17 acres were on the list, and her 17 acres, according to her father's water table survey from 6 years ago, sat directly above the primary aquifer recharge zone for the eastern county's ridgeline well system, which meant that whoever held valid water access rights to her parcel held something that mattered enormously, not in normal years, but in a dry one. She did not announce this. She banked the heat lower and steadier and went on reading. She wrote her numbers in the ledger notebook. She drove to the state archive office in the Capitol 3 times over the spring, presenting herself as a family researcher doing genealogical work, which was not entirely untrue, and obtained certified copies of 17 originating deeds. She had them compared by a retired title examiner she found in a neighboring county, a woman named Hartley, who charged her a flat fee of $600, which left Clara with $940 in her account, which was, as she noted in the ledger notebook, the thinnest the arithmetic had ever been. Hartley looked at the comparisons for 2 days, and then called Clara and said in a careful voice that she needed to know what Clara intended to do with this, because what she was looking at was the kind of thing that had implications. Clara said she intended to do what was right with it. Hartley was quiet for a moment. Then she said she had been a title examiner for 31 years and had never once seen anything like it, and that the water rights implications for the ridgeline parcels were, in a technical legal sense, extremely significant. She said significant like a doctor says a test result is interesting, which is to say she meant it was the most significant thing she had ever examined and was being modest about it as a professional courtesy. Clara thanked her, paid the $600, and drove home in the gathering heat of early June. The summer was the driest anyone in Harlan County could remember with confidence. By July, the creek beds were showing stone that had not been exposed since a drought 31 years prior. By August, the conventional wells on the lower valley parcels were pulling air. The farmers with deeper wells were drawing them down faster than the aquifer recharged. Gerald Pratt had been busy all summer, busier than usual, visiting farms with his clipboard and his reasonable smile, and now his offers were not framed as generosity, but as rescue. Clara heard about it from Marta, who came on Thursdays as she had promised, and who reported each week's news from the county with the measured cadence of someone who had seen droughts before and knew that the worst part of a drought was not the absence of water, but the decisions made by frightened people in the absence of water. Marta said, "The land is not punishing them. The land is simply being itself. It is the ones who never learn to listen who are finding out they do not know the language." Clara poured the coffee and said nothing, and thought about the aquifer recharge zone under her 17 acres, which Marta's words had just framed for her more clearly than any of her father's technical language had managed. Gerald Pratt came to her property in the first week of August. He was alone this time, without his legal team, and his warmth was several degrees higher than it had been in October, which meant his situation was more urgent. He told her that the consortium had reconsidered its initial offer. He was now empowered, he said, to offer her $65,000 for the parcel, including a generous conveyance timeline that would let her remain in the farmhouse through the end of the year. He said this was exceptional for a 17-acre ridgeline parcel with no working agricultural output. Clara said she appreciated the visit. He said he wanted to make sure she understood the water situation in the county, that the Lower Valley farmers were in a difficult position, that there was talk of a regional management authority being formed that might have compulsory acquisition powers, which he said with a delicacy that let the threat speak for itself, without him having to own it. Clara said she would think about it. He left. She went inside and wrote $65,000 in the ledger notebook and circled it twice. Then she went to the archive room and pulled her father's water table survey and calculated, on the basis of the recharge rate estimates for the aquifer and the current drawdown rates reported in the county extension bulletin she subscribed to, how many parcels would be dependent on that recharge zone by the end of a second dry year. She wrote that number down too. It was a larger number than 65,000 by a very wide margin. The outside validator came in late August, which Clara had not planned, but had perhaps half expected, the way you half expect rain when the barometric pressure has been dropping for 2 days. His name was Owen Price, a hydrological consultant based in another state, who had been engaged by a coalition of valley municipalities 3 counties east to conduct a regional water security survey. He had found her father's name in a citation in an obscure state geological bulletin from 6 years prior, followed the citation to the Harlan County address, and called Clara to ask if Raymond Voss's water table surveys were available for review. Clara told him they were. He drove to the property on a Thursday, a lean, quiet man of 44, with the methodical manner of someone who spent his professional life reading what the ground was saying. And he spent 4 hours in the archive room with Clara's permission, and a cup of coffee. When he came out, he was not a dramatic person, and did not behave dramatically, but he sat down at the kitchen table and looked at Clara for a moment and said, "Your father knew this aquifer better than any official survey in existence." He said the originating recharge zone mapping in the archive was 20 years ahead of the state's current understanding of the ridgeline system. He said that whoever held the water access rights to this parcel in the current regulatory environment held the single most strategically significant water asset in a 4-county region. Then he asked what she intended to do with it. Clara said she intended to do what was right. He said that was what Raymond Voss had said in the geological bulletin, nearly word for word, which made Clara set down her coffee cup carefully and take a breath. She asked if Price would provide her with a written technical assessment on his firm's letterhead. He said he would, and he would do it free of charge, because the survey Raymond Voss had left behind had saved his coalition 6 months of work, and he considered it a professional debt. She had the letter in her hands the following Wednesday. She put it in the archive room, in the crate she had labeled current, and she laid Hartley's title examination summary beside it, and she looked at the 2 documents together, and she thought, now the arithmetic is finished. Now the ledger is ready. It was Eli who found the last piece, though Clara did not frame it that way to him and would not have wanted him to feel the weight of it. He was helping her refile a batch of her father's later ledger pages in early September when he stopped and said, without looking up, that there was a number in this entry that was the same as a number he had seen somewhere else. He held up a page. The entry was from 4 years prior and recorded a water usage figure for a parcel now held by Meridian. Clara looked at the number. She felt something cold and precise move through her chest. The number was a draw rate estimate that her father had calculated from private observation and noted as a projection. The same number appeared in a Meridian internal planning document that had been submitted as an exhibit in an unrelated county board proceeding 2 years ago, and that Clara had pulled from the public record as background research. Meridian's document had presented the figure as the result of their own proprietary survey. Her father's ledger was dated 4 years before Meridian's document. If someone at Meridian had accessed her father's survey data without authorization, had used it in their own planning while simultaneously claiming the water rights that data described, then the question of how they had accessed it led somewhere that changed the shape of the whole story. Clara stood in the archive room for a long time with Eli's found page in her hand. Then she said quietly that he had been very helpful. He nodded and went back to his filing. She stood there and thought about the difference between hidden and held, and thought that her father's archive had always been the held kind, waiting for someone ready to receive it. She filed a request for the county mediation session with 4 days' notice, citing the property records dispute procedure under the state's County Records Integrity Statute, a mechanism her father had helpfully annotated in a margin note in one of the later crates. She brought to the session 37 crates of her father's documented research, Hartley's title examination summary with certified copies of 17 originating deeds, Owen Price's technical assessment on letterhead, a supplementary analysis of the aquifer recharge zone prepared by Price's firm at her request during September, which she had paid for with the $940, and a payment arrangement for the remainder, which was the last of the arithmetic, the final line in the ledger, and the archive page Eli had found beside the Meridian Planning Document exhibit with the matching figures highlighted in yellow on both documents. She did not bring a lawyer. She had consulted one by phone, a woman in the Capitol who handled property rights cases and who had told Clara that her documentation was unusually solid and that Clara should be the one to present it because she understood it better than anyone else alive, and a mediator would see that. She brought the cardboard box because the key documents fit in it and because she had learned from her father's example that the most important things do not require a large container. Gerald Pratt had tried 3 things in the preceding 2 weeks that Clara had anticipated and prepared for, and did not show that she had anticipated. He had approached 2 of the 6 affected original landowners with new consolidation offers, telling them that a woman alone was planning to use the water rights dispute to extract a private settlement that would leave the county worse off. She knew this because one of those landowners, a man named Gruber, whose family had farmed the lower valley since before the war, and who had been one of the louder voices in the earlier community skepticism about Clara, had come to her door in the 2nd week of September with his hat in his hands, not literally but close enough. He had come because his well was at 14 feet of draw and falling, and he could not make his October payment on his equipment loan, and the consolidation offer Pratt had brought him would clear the loan but take the farm. And he had come to Clara because he did not know what else to do, and because his wife had told him to go talk to that woman who is the only one in the county not drowning. He stood in the yard and said he was sorry for the things he had said at the feed store in October of last year. He said it simply, without excuse, the way a man says something he has rehearsed and found no better version of. Clara said she appreciated him coming. She told him not to sign anything with Meridian. She told him his water access rights under the original deed were still valid if he had kept the originating document, and she asked if he had it. He said he thought his wife had it in a fireproof box from when they bought the place. Clara said to keep it safe and to be at the municipal hall on Tuesday morning at 9. He asked what was going to happen. She said she was going to show the county what the ledger says. He put his hat back on and thanked her and left. She watched him go and felt neither triumph nor satisfaction, but something quieter, the feeling of a long calculation checking out. In the municipal hall on Tuesday morning, Clara waited until the mediator had gavelled the session open and Gerald Pratt had begun his prepared presentation, which cited water scarcity emergency protocols and invoked the Regional Management Authority mechanism he had mentioned to Clara in August. He spoke for 12 minutes. He was polished, and his documentation was extensive, and he spoke about the public good with the conviction of a man who had said those words so often they had lost their specific meaning entirely. Then the mediator turned to Clara. She opened the box. She did not make a speech. She laid out the documents in an order she had planned, and she described each one in plain language. The originating deeds and the recorded copies and the discrepancies and the pattern her father had named substitution. And she described Hartley's findings and Price's assessment and the aquifer's significance and the parcel's recharge zone position. She spoke for 22 minutes. She was quiet the entire time, in the way that a person is quiet when they are saying exactly what they mean and have no need to perform it. When she reached the matching figures, the draw rate number that appeared in her father's ledger 4 years before it appeared in Meridian's planning document, she put both documents on the table and did not characterize them. She let the mediator and the room look at the dates. Pratt said that the figure was a standard estimate derivable from public geological data. Clara said she was sure that was right, and that it would be a simple matter for anyone to check whether a public source for that specific figure existed prior to her father's calculation, and she happened to have researched that question. She set a third document on the table. There was no prior public source. The figure was Raymond Voss's. The room was very quiet. Pratt's legal team was writing with speed and urgency. Pratt himself looked at the table with the expression of a man watching an arithmetic problem resolve against him in real time. The mediator called a recess. During the recess, several things happened that Clara had not specifically planned but had suspected were within the range of possibility. 3 of the 6 affected landowners who were present, including Gruber, approached the mediator directly. The 2 landowners Pratt had approached with consolidation offers the previous week produced the offers from their pockets and laid them on the mediator's side table. One of Pratt's legal team members asked to speak with Pratt privately, and they went into the hallway, and when Pratt came back, he looked like a man who had just been told by counsel that the situation had changed materially. Marta Solis, who had arrived quietly and sat in the back row without Clara having known she was coming, sat with her hands folded and her eyes steady, and did not say anything. But when Clara glanced at her during the recess, Marta gave a single slow nod, the kind of nod that means the land held it until the right person came to receive it. When the session resumed, Pratt's team submitted a formal objection to the validity of the originating deed comparisons on procedural grounds. The mediator said she would note the objection for the record, and that the matter would be referred to the State Records Integrity Board for formal adjudication, but that in the interim, the water access easement claims currently held by Meridian on the affected parcels would be suspended pending review, which was a technical determination, but amounted to a very large practical fact in a county where the wells were at 14 feet and falling. Pratt stood and said that the community deserved to know that suspending those claims put the Regional Water Management Initiative at risk, and that his consortium was the only party in a position to fund and administer the infrastructure that would be needed to address the shortage. He said this with the calm authority of a man who believes the winning card is still in his hand. Clara waited until he had finished. She said she appreciated his concern for the community's water needs. She said that the recharge zone capacity of the aquifer under her parcel, as documented in Owen Price's assessment, was sufficient to supply augmented draw for the affected valley parcels if access was managed cooperatively among the landowners rather than controlled by a single managing entity. She said she was prepared to register a cooperative water access covenant on her parcel, open to all 27 parcels identified in her father's research under a shared-use framework that a property rights attorney in the capital had drafted pro bono upon reviewing the case materials. She said the framework required no payment to her or to any corporation. It required only that the participating landowners contribute labor to the maintenance of the access infrastructure on a rotating basis, a condition she characterized as payment in kind for a shared resource rather than a fee for a private one. She said her father had been a custodian of this county's records for 11 years, and she considered this covenant to be the custodial act his work had been building toward, and she intended to record it whether or not anyone else participated, because it was the thing the archive had been holding until someone was ready to receive it. The room did not erupt. It did not applaud. What happened was closer to a long exhale, the sound a room makes when 40 people let go of a fear they have been carrying for 6 weeks. Gruber stood up slowly from the second row. He had his hat in his hands this time, literally. He said he reckoned he owed her an apology and a signature if she had a line for one. 2 other farmers stood without speaking and nodded. A woman Clara did not know well, who ran a market garden on the valley floor and had been specifically harsh at a town board meeting the previous November about the waste of good ridgeline acreage, looked at her hands for a moment and then looked up and said plainly that she had been wrong and she would like to sign. Pratt gathered his folders. His legal team gathered theirs. He did not speak again to the room. He walked to the door with the clipped efficiency of a man converting a departure into a performance of dignity, and when he reached it, he turned once and looked at Clara, and the look contained several things, none of them words. And then he was gone. He had been undone by decency rather than force, and he knew it, and could find no handle on it. Marta came to her that Thursday, as she always did, and they sat on the porch in the early October air that had at last given up a little of its dryness, as if the atmospheric pressure of the county had changed along with something less meteorological. Marta poured the coffee and looked out at the ridgeline and said, "Your father knew the difference between what the land hides and what it holds. He spent 11 years learning it. You learned it in 18 months. She paused and then said, "That is not a small thing." Clara said she thought the speed had something to do with having the ledger to follow. Marta said no, the ledger was her father's work. Following it and understanding where it pointed, that was hers. They drank their coffee. Below them in the valley the wells were still low, and the drought was not over, and the legal process would take the better part of a year, and the rains had not yet come in the way they were needed. But 3 days after the mediation session, 4 of the affected landowners had already filed to participate in the cooperative covenant, and 2 more had called. And Owen Price had contacted Clara to say his municipal coalition was interested in the model as a potential framework for water security planning across the 4-county region, which meant her father's archive was going to be read by people who could use it. The arithmetic had changed entirely. The arithmetic had become something she could not have predicted from the first line of the ledger, which had read, 1 woman, 17 acres, $4,200. 1 woman alone is what people had said, and they had meant it as a diminishment and a prediction. What they had not known, what could not be read from the outside of a thing, was that alone does not mean without resources. It means without company while you do the slow, necessary work. And the work had been done, and the ledger was open, and the land had given back what it had been holding in its own time to someone who had learned to receive it. Eli came up the lane that afternoon with a jar his mother had sent. He sat on the porch step and looked at the sky and said, "Do you think it's going to rain?" Clara said she thought it was going to rain. He said, "Your father had a rain gauge. I found it in the barn. Should I put it out?" She said yes. He went to put it out. Marta watched him go and smiled and said nothing. Clara held her coffee cup with both hands and looked at the ridgeline and felt the thing that she had come to understand was not triumph, not vindication, not the satisfaction of having been right when others were wrong, but something simpler and more permanent than any of those. She was home. The ledger was settled. The land was ready to be listened to again. Whatever the rain gauge caught in the morning, she would record it in the first line of the next book.